Hi everyone, Julia Usher, Recipes for a Sweet Life. I'm back with the second in my summer botanical series, and this time I'm doing my new all-time fave dimensional royal icing flower, and it's my favorite right now because it's only a 6-part flower as opposed to the 17-part clematis that I did a couple of weeks ago. It's also composed entirely off the cookie. I can put it together, let it dry, and then slide it onto the cookie as opposed to assembling it directly on the cookie petal by petal. And I always find that when I can pre-assemble off the cookie and move things over, it's a little less stressful for me. Anyway, I am exaggerating the stress here. It's actually a really fun cookie. It is labor intensive, but when it comes together, it's just really a marvel and a work of art and something that everyone will appreciate as a signature cookie on a platter or as a special gift. I'm going to be showing you different variations scrolling overhead, and I'm going to step aside and show you the finished project. And then we'll get into a couple of other housekeeping notes and then what you'll need for the project. So here's just one example of a finished cookie. It's got hibiscus leaves, 2 different tropical leaves. Actually, this has 1, but I've done 2 different variations of leaves, which you may see on some of the other cookies. The hibiscus flower itself, as well as hibiscus buds. So we've got a number of pieces we're going to be making in addition to the 6 pieces that comprise the hibiscus. The background is airbrushed and stenciled with a stencil I designed specifically for this cookie and which will be released in a couple of weeks. A couple of housekeeping notes. The first is a thank you to Manu, who is a contributor to my site Cookie Connection. A year or 2 ago, she wrote a really inspirational tutorial, which is a water lily based on the same piecework construction techniques. I've since adapted it and enjoyed using it to create a bunch of other flowers that you'll find in my spring and summer series. I also apply my unique sort of airbrushing twist to it. But the original concept and construction of her water lily was one of the sources of inspiration for me here as I launched this series. So thank you, Manu. Now, secondly, for the big announcement, and that is, as you know, we've all been under lockdown. We've all not been seeing our friends and colleagues as much as we might like to. And so I decided to correct that. And I'm doing that by creating a new service for you all. It will be riding the SUPERPEER platform, and you'll see their logo scrolling overhead. In addition, a lot more information about the service can be found in links in the video description. But basically what it is a service that allows you to connect with me for live video phone calls. Either 30 minutes or 60 minutes in duration. We can cover whatever your heart desires. If you haven't gotten all your questions answered about this video, we can do a follow-up call. If you've attended one of my hands-on decorating classes but didn't really figure 1 or 2 techniques out, we could even do like a hands-on 1 technique-based kind of lesson. So the sky's the limit. I'd love just talking to you and meeting you as well. So I do encourage you to check it out. Again, more information is in the video description. There is a small charge for the service to pay for my time prepping for videos if that's a requirement, but also to help subsidize the cost of making these YouTube videos. So that's it. Great news on all fronts. I'm going to move now to what you'll need for this project. So for this project, you'll want a cookie that's fairly ample in size, maybe 4 to 5 inches on both dimensions. I've got 2 different shapes here. I've used both in making these hibiscus cookies, as you'll see in some of the examples flying overhead, but I tend to prefer the smaller one, so we'll probably be working on that today. It's useful to have the icing dried all the way through. We will be airbrushing on it, not applying that much pressure, but a little bit, and you don't want to crack the icing. In addition, for making all the hibiscus parts, the parts of the flower itself, as well as the leaves, you're going to need some templates. And I'll be introducing a variety of templates as we go throughout. But typically I look for photographs of the flower that come down at a head-on view, so I get a nice planar view of the petal or the leaf or whatever it is I'm trying to replicate so that I can trace over it nicely without a lot of distortion from different camera angles. So a top-down view is generally best. Of course, if you have actual plants or flowers of what you're trying to replicate in front of you, that really helps you tune in on all the fine details and thinking of ways you might be able to replicate them. Now, all of these cookies are comprised of individual royal icing parts pieced together, as I mentioned, all individually airbrushed, but they're not just your ordinary royal icing transfers. The petals, the leaves, all the elements are curved. I call these contoured royal icing transfers. And we're going to be creating them by tracing over templates with royal icing, on either acetate or parchment paper, and I'll talk a bit about which substrate is best for piping which parts as we go through the video, and I address this in other of my flower videos too. And then to shape them, we'll be either shaping them on a big tube for parts where we want a gentle curve, or on a narrower tube where we want a more acute, really curvy piece. So we'll have pieces of acetate and parchment paper. These tubes, these range from about 1 inch to 1 3/4 inch in diameter. I think I even used some slightly over 2 inches in this video, but I'll have all the tubes used for which part also in the video description. Once they're piped on the acetate or parchment and wrapped around this, they need to be secured in place. So you do need some painter's tape, something that goes down easily, sticks, and easily comes off to secure them. You will also need a little bit of shortening as we get into the assembly process of the flower itself. I like to stick the parchment paper down with shortening so it doesn't buckle and curl. So you need a bit of that. And for some of the stems, you'll need a round tip, and for filler leaves, where there are gaps on the cookie, I'll be using 2 leaf tips, and I'll have all the exact dimensions in the video description, and we'll also try to call them out as we go through the video. Now, once you've created all these things to go on top of the cookie, I want to arrange it on a background that has some interest as well, because there'll be some voids on the cookie where I don't have royal icing pieces. I want some other element to pop through. And for that, I'm using my custom stencil that I made for this project, which will be released shortly. I'm just going to section off a portion of it, however. This is the background element of a much larger set that has many other pieces, and I'll be showing it in another video too. I'm just going to select out this part that has mini hibiscus and a monstera leaf in it. To secure that on the cookie, we might need to use the stencil genie or frame, as well as magnets. Of course, to apply all those airbrush colorings, you need an airbrush system, a minimum of 1 airbrush and a compressor. I'd like to have a dedicated airbrush to each color. It's a little bit of an investment, but it pays back relatively quickly in time saved cleaning guns. And I have a whole nother video that addresses that. So I do have a dedicated airbrush to each color for this particular project. And then lastly, you might be wondering what this contraption here on the end is, but the classic hibiscus flower has this center that kind of arcs out. And so I want to create that not on a flat surface, because if I pipe that flat, when I pick it up, the backside will be flat. I want it to be fully round all the way around. So we're going to be piping the arc in a suspended fashion off this little rack. I've got pieces of acetate, and I had a piece of parchment paper here. You can use either. And we're going to be piping it upside down, letting it dry, and then taking it off for that particular part of the project. If you don't have a contraption like this is an old antique order rack for use in a restaurant. You can use the edge of a counter or something that has a little bit of drop to it. You're going to be dropping the piece about 1/2 inch. In this section, we're going to begin the piecework, starting first with all the flower petals, the flower center, and then I'll progress to all the greenery. I'm going to be doing 3 different types of leaves and also stems. First and foremost, find your template. I spoke about this earlier. It's nice to have a nice top-down view. I'm going to basically trace this petal here, except bring it in slightly and give it a more ruffled edge, because I don't want my hibiscus to be quite as big as this one here. Typically when I'm creating templates, I'll print out them at various sizes. I'll do a couple of sample petals and I'll piece them together, and then I'll get a sense for the overall scale of the flower. And if I need to bring it up or bring it down, I can just move up or down on the templates that I've copied. So after some trial and error, I settled on this one, but bringing it in just a touch for the petal. So you'll see that scribbled pen mark is what I'm going to try to trace around. The typical petal, I do a ruffled edge. It's curved way the heck back, as you can see, so we're going to be shaping it over a very narrow tube to give it that kind of curve. And it's got 3 or 4 veins coming off to the side, as well as a dominant central one. So the 3 to 4 off the side are a bit recessed, and that's because I piped them flat on the surface before wrapping them on the tube, and they kind of sink into the underlying icing. By contrast, the one down the center was piped after being wrapped, and that gives it more relief. So I'm piping on acetate here. It's hard to see, but that is acetate down, and I'm doing that because it will have a shinier, smoother backside than if I were to pipe on parchment paper, and some back part of the petal may show in this construction. I'm using my thick flooding consistency both to outline and flood, so the outline merges into the interior of the petal. And as I mentioned before, I'm moving now to a thicker icing, maybe the equivalent of a number 0 or number 1 tip, to put down some veins, 2 outer ones on each side of center in advance. As you'll see, and as I said before, these will somewhat disappear or recede into that underlying icing as I move it up to be wrapped, but that's my intention here. I want them to kind of fade away relative to the center line, which we'll put down after it's wrapped. Just clean up that end there with your trussing needle. In this case, I want all the petals to be really curvy, so rather than placing them lengthwise, I'm placing them crosswise on a fairly narrow tube. This is about an inch, inch and a quarter, and taping them down well until they're completely dry. However, before that, I do want to pipe down that remaining center line, the one that I want to stay accentuated. Okay, that looks pretty good. Clean up any ends and set that aside to dry, ideally overnight. Now onto the small petals for the buds. They consist of two shapes, one that's wider on one end and one that's narrow all the way down the length. The wider ones will go on the outside and the narrower ones will go on the inside. For that template, I'm just going to trace a smaller portion on the inside of what I did for the bigger petal. And again, I'm giving them a more fluted edge than what's on my template. Using the same thick flooding consistency to outline and flood. Here I'm piping on parchment paper because for some reason I found that when I did these on acetate, they always cratered. But on parchment paper, they do not. Perhaps that has to do with how acutely I'm bending them. As you can see, I'm literally folding the paper almost in half on one end, completely actually folding it on one end, and securing it just on that one end, so it's really tight. I'll be taping that end together and then setting it aside, maybe taping it to the counter to dry so it stays upright. But again, if I pipe on parchment paper here instead of acetate, it'll stay nice and smooth on top, but if I do it on acetate, I get a big cavity in the center oftentimes. I think that's because it just doesn't dry as quickly on acetate as it does on parchment paper, which breathes all the way through. Now for the smaller petal, I'm actually pleating it and crimping it on both ends so it's really tight and taping it on both ends as well, and then taping it to the counter to dry. Again, that'll dry overnight and then fall off the parchment paper. Now for the stalk-like hibiscus center, I want it well rounded on all sides, so I'm going to pipe it suspended from that rack I showed you earlier. I'm not going to pipe it flat. I'm using a thick outlining consistency, making contact with the parchment paper taped to the rack at one end and then letting it drop and then making contact at the other end. This is about 1.5 inches long and 1/2 inch deep. Once it's dry, you can just push back on the parchment paper on either end and it'll drop nicely to safety onto soft paper towel. This is not yet dry though, so let's let it dry overnight. Once dry and once they're released, I want to pipe some details on the end that's going to be uppermost in the flower. And for that I'm using yellow icing of beadwork consistency, working on one side at a time. You might want to wait a little bit between dots because the icing's rather loose. You don't want them to merge together. So I'm going to come back in after the first set is dried and add a few more yellow dots, like so. And once that's completely dry, I'll add some orange dots for highlights. Once that's completely dried again, I'll then flip it over and repeat that entire process with both yellow dots and orange dots on the opposite side. The dots only extend about 1/2 inch down the length. Now to finish it all off, I want to cap it off with some red that matches the red of the stalk, but this is beadwork consistency now. I'm just going to pipe 3 red dots at the end to keep it simple. Just envision that the other side was already piped. I would pipe both sides with yellow and orange before putting on the red dots. On to the greenery. Now I want to pipe a classic hibiscus leaf for which I'm going to rely on the template over here once again. I also want to pipe a hibiscus stem, which has little teeny little spikes on it. And then for added interest on the cookie, I want some leaves of slightly different color and shape. So I'm going to be piping some monstera leaves, those classic wide leaves with holes. And also some longer leaves. I probably won't demonstrate how to make these longer leaves because the process is basically the same as the hibiscus leaf, it's just using a longer template. You'll note, before I get started, that I've got 3 or 4 different sizes of hibiscus leaf. And in all cases, I use the same template. I just kind of piped inside of it if I wanted a smaller leaf. They're also curved to varying degrees. Some have relatively shallow curves, which is an indication it was shaped over a relatively big tube. Some have more acute curves or really curvy, which is an indication that they might have been shaped rather than lengthwise along the tube, crosswise or over even a smaller tube. But for the purposes of this demo, I'm going to use about a 1 3/4 inch tube. In the video description, I'll have an indication of the full range of tubes I use for each type of piece. Some of them are not only curved back, they're curved up. So here's an indication of a leaf that's curved slightly up as opposed to curved back. Some curve more up than others. And certainly this Monstera leaf is curved up. This one, by contrast, this really big one is curved way down. So to get an up curve, I'm shaping inside a tube as opposed to over it, often using half-cut paper towel rolls for the purpose. Some are really tight and are more curvy, and others are kind of flimsy cardboard and they'll open up more. So you can also control the degree of curve just by kind of opening it up once you've cut it. But I'm going to start first with all the leaf green material, starting first with the stems and then moving on to the hibiscus leaves. They use the same color of icing in 3 different consistencies. I use the thickest consistency for the stems because it really has to hold a nice tight shape. Then I use a loose flooding consistency for the base of the leaf and an outlining consistency, which is midway between the flood and the stem consistency for the fine line down the center. So for the stems, I like to pipe on parchment paper directly off the roll, so there's some curve to the parchment paper which will give curve to the stem in the end. We're going to pipe largely on the trough of the parchment paper, but extend up on the curled edges a bit. I do tape it down before piping because it's easier to get up on the edge if it's completely flat to start, and I'm using a number 3 Atico tip to give it a consistently round shape from stem to stem. I could use a parchment pastry cone here, but this way I'm assured of always having the same diameter stem. And I'm just piping a gentle arc. I'll do 2 on this piece of parchment paper in different directions. We want them going in different directions to add interest to the cookie and to give us some decorating options. I'm going to give them a little texture by pushing out a little icing in the tip and then touching it to the stem to give it that thorny-like texture. And then I'm going to release the tape and give some curl back to that parchment paper to give curl to the stem. Once it's dry, the icing that is, it should fall easily off the parchment paper. I don't use acetate for that because the pieces are long and delicate, and if I did, they would likely not come off without breaking. By contrast, here on this leaf for the hibiscus, I am going to use acetate. It's a relatively small, sturdy piece, so I'm sure it'll come off without breaking. Plus, some backside is going to show in the final construction, and I want that backside to be smooth and shiny, and it's going to be shinier on acetate than on parchment paper, as I mentioned earlier. I'm using my thick flooding consistency icing here both to outline and flood the leaf so that the outline merges into the leaf itself. And then we're going to wrap it on the tube in a variety of directions. We want some diagonal, some lengthwise, some perpendicular to give some variation to the leaves. And I'm now moving to my outlining consistency, which is a thicker consistency than the flooding consistency, to add the vein on top. I'm doing it last, as I mentioned before, so it retains its definition as opposed to sinking into the icing. I'm going to show you another hibiscus leaf, but this time we're going to contour it so that it's curling up rather than curling down, as in the last case. Outlining and flooding exactly the same way, teasing the icing into the tip with my trussing needle, and then placing it into the trough of a paper towel tube that's been cut in half. Now, it's best to tape that acetate in place. Sometimes it'll stay put, but just to be safe, I like to tape it down because if it moves, it'll break the icing if the icing isn't yet dry. Now, piping that vein in the same way I did before and setting that aside to dry overnight. Onto the second type of leaf, which is the typical broad-based Monstera leaf with holes. I'm going to pipe one here. I might skip the holes this time, but if you're going to pipe holes, just be sure to leave a few as you're outlining and flooding. Here I'm using a moss green icing, a light moss green as opposed to the light leaf green I used earlier, but the outlining and flooding technique is exactly the same as before. And again, I didn't leave any holes. You could, that's completely optional. Releasing the acetate and taping this over a tube. I want less curve to these broad leaves, and because there's more icing on them, I have to give them less curve. Otherwise, the icing just drips off the tube if I try to curl it too much. And again, be sure to tape it down really, really well so the acetate doesn't lift while the icing is still drying or the icing will crack. And we're going to apply that outlining consistency icing for the vein as the last and final step so that it sinks less into the icing and remains more distinct. Ta-da, that looks great. Okay, we finished piping all the parts, all the greenery, all the petal parts. Now it's time to airbrush them now that they're completely dry and removed either from their acetate or parchment. I'm going to start with the green leaves because I have them out, and the stems. And I'd like to start with a light icing color so that when I airbrush, I can add a darker shade on top that gives them a little depth and dimension. And I'm simply, for the stems, going to apply a darker leaf green. Generally, I apply it in the direction of the arc as if it's shadowed in the direction it's curving. So holding the stem from one end on something soft like paper towel, you want to airbrush the one side, as I mentioned before, to add some shadow here. And I'm using a Maricolor leaf green. It's as simple as that. Set it aside. Now on to the hibiscus leaves. I want to start doing the back side. Here I'm airbrushing straight down to cover the entire back side. Some portion of this may show, but it's not going to be showing that much, so I don't need to be too careful about it. Let me show you that again, coming from top down, using my leaf green, and you want to make sure you hit the end that you were holding to eliminate that white spot. Now for the top, I want to give it more detailing by airbrushing electric purple, which looks kind of pink, down the center. So it's going to have a little purple stripe down the center, purple-pink stripe. I'm coming top down here. Now all subsequent shading after I put this other pink stripe down on the second leaf will be done from the side. I don't want to lose all the light green, original leaf green color of the icing. I just want to highlight, or rather shadow, the edges with the leaf green. So the two greens will be revealing, the leaf green on the edge and the original leaf green in the icing, to give this a lot of interest in addition to the electric purple down the center. If I were to apply that leaf green top down though, I'd cover most of the leaf, and we don't want to do that. Now these Monstera leaves will be done the same way though, with a different green color. Here I'm using AmeriColor Moss Green. Actually, it's AmeriColor Avocado is the actual name. Hitting the entire backside, then doing an electric purple stripe down the center along the vein, and then airbrushing from the side and from the back, not top down, to get all the edges of the leaves, including those in between the little sections of the leaves. And that looks super. Okay, I'm taking a little artistic license with the hibiscus petal, not doing the classic red, starting first on the back side with all electric purple, then using my fingers as stencils to portion off a triangular area in the center of the petal and hitting it red, orange around the outer edge, and then hitting from the side with electric purple to finish it off. So it'll be a three-tone petal for the big petals. Now onto the small petals. I'm just going to do those in two colors, red on the interior as if it's opening up to the red center we did on the bigger petal, and then electric purple along the tips and also on the outer back side, hitting with electric pink now, or purple I should say, on the back side. Now you want to do both small petals and big petals. Now we're going to start piecing those buds together with those small pieces we just did in red and electric purple. You can piece them together in a variety of ways. The simplest way is just to put two small pieces together to do a two-petal bud. The next most elaborate thing is to put a bigger one on the outside for a three-pronged bud, or three-petaled bud. But typically I do anywhere from 3 to 5 petals. And to put them together, once the airbrush coloring is dry, which is really instantaneous, I just use a dab of icing on the inside. It could be any color as long as it doesn't show. I'm using white here because it's easiest to clean off and it's relatively thick. And I'm nestling two rather narrow ones together, interlocking them like so. Now I want to put another big petal on the outside of them, so I'm putting a little icing on the inside of that big petal, and I'm going to put it over the most unattractive area of the last one I did, making sure that everything comes to a nice tight point at the end because we want it to make a clean intersection with the stems that we're going to attach it to later. You don't want a really clunky end, or it's not going to make a nice tight connection to the stems. That looks great. If any icing's showing, take a damp liner paintbrush and clean it off before it dries. Okay, on to the final big flower assembly. I do that on parchment paper, so once it's dry, it comes off quite readily without any petals popping off. The first step is to pipe down a blob of red icing glue to match the red on the petals, and I'm sticking 3 petals in the back on top of the icing and propping them up with couplers. I like couplers because they've got ridges on them and they're less slippery than pastry tips, but either would work. Just leave room for those last 2 petals and push them as close together as possible because all we need room for is that center stem. You want to push down all icing as well to make room for that center stem, and then set that aside to dry completely overnight so it looks something like this in the end. You don't want to be assembling the stem with the petals moving, so this needs to be completely dry at this point. Using the same red icing glue, sticking in my center, and then propping it up at the angle I'd like, generally off to the side with a little bit of paper towel. Now the last step here before setting it aside to dry is to clean up any extra icing around the center with a damp liner paintbrush. You don't want any icing popping up around the center in the final construction. So we've got our focal flower all together, all airbrushed, all assembled. It's drying. Now I'm ready to start the final decorating of the background of the cookie and the final assembly on the cookie itself. Now here's a cookie I airbrushed a little bit earlier, a much bigger shape, and you'll see a variation of this cookie floating overhead that uses this actual cookie shape. But the thing to note about it isn't so much the shape of the cookie, but rather the softness of the airbrushing underneath. I don't have really strong colors, certainly not as strong as what I put down on the flowers, because I want the flowers to really pop off of it. I just want a subtle suggestion of color of additional jungle flowers or tropical flowers in the background. So all of these colors were substantially softened with Spectrum Flow White, which is an alcohol-based white that dries really quickly, and not with watery spots as some of the water-based whites do. So my turquoise literally is a mix of a full cavity of white in the airbrush with just a trussing needle's worth of turquoise in it to give this pale turquoise hue. I'm using Spectrum Flow Baby Pink with a touch of additional pink to it. It's already naturally very, very light. Again, it's alcohol-based for the flower itself. I am using the same red that we used on the flower, but I'm going to add some white to it. And then I'm using electric green, moss green, and an electric purple here, but again, a substantial amount of white added. I'm working with a stencil, as I mentioned, that I specifically designed for this project. It's part of my Dynamic Duo series, which you can find on confectioncouturestencils.com. And it's a multi-stencil layered set that allows you to put messages together with different flowers and birds and all sorts of things. I'll be showing that in another video coming up. But for now, we're just using the background stencil on it, and I'm just sectioning out a portion. I don't want the whole background covered. I want this off to the edge so the bulk of the rest of the cookie can be occupied by the pretty flowers we just spent a lot of time creating. One thing I should mention in blocking off the stencil is to be sure to use painter's tape. That's because when you're done, you can set the stencil in water and the painter's tape will literally lift off. You won't have to tug it off at all, and you won't do any damage to the stencil. I am going to start with the red, lightening it up with white as you saw, and hit the centers. Since I'm working with relatively light colors throughout, I can pretty much go in any order I want. Typically, though, I do start light to dark. But hitting the centers of the flowers with red, then electric purple down the center of the leaf, then electric green for the rest of the leaf, and then moss green to highlight the edges of the leaves and also the stems. And lastly, I'm coming in with electric purple. The key thing, though, technique-wise, is I'm operating at a 90-degree angle to the cookie about 1 to 2 inches away. That assures I can get into the tight spots with minimal overspray into adjacent areas. And by operating at a 90-degree angle, I get very little, if no, underspray. I want to shade the cookie. I'm operating from overhead with the turquoise to give a light blue shading to the top of the cookie, and now coming in at an angle to more darkly shade the edge with blue. I'm going to hit that edge one more time to just darken it up a little bit more, and that looks great. Okay, we've got everything airbrushed. I actually did put orange dots down around this cookie, as you can see here. They've dried, and now I'm ready to put all the things we've assembled or airbrushed onto the cookie. I did a trial arrangement. I'm thinking of anchoring a big hibiscus here, a big leaf here, one of the monsteras for contrasting color, then tucking some leaves in and behind the hibiscus. As you recall, its construction is such that it sort of leans forward, so there's a big area in the back that I need to fill, probably with a leaf, and probably additionally with one of these bigger buds. Then off to the side, I'll put some stray branches, maybe a few little more buds, and a couple of leaves. I'm not going to put this all together. It might typically take me an hour or more to do this, depending on how fussy I get. What I would like to do is at least get the anchor flower down so you can see the typical gluing process and get a couple of leaves down, maybe one representative piece. Then we'll cut to some finished examples to show you what the end product might be. Now to get the hibiscus on, the key thing is to slide it on. You don't want to pick it up or you could pop off one of those petals that we so carefully put together. So slide it on. I generally don't touch it with my fingers either. I tend to do more damage with my big clunky fingers, so I'm always moving it around with a trussing needle. Once I know where I want it, I put a little bit of icing glue down in white and then just slide it onto the icing. Again, using my trussing needle to get it in place. And just be sure to orient the hibiscus so it looks good in the direction it's primarily going to be viewed. These cookies are somewhat directional, so I like to make sure it looks good as viewed from bottom front of the cookie. Now there's a big gap in the back, as I mentioned, so I'm slipping that monstera leaf in. You'll notice I propped it up with a little blob of fondant and glued it to that with the same white icing glue. I like to work with white icing glue as opposed to matching it to any other color on the cookie because it's simply easier to clean it off than any other cookie if I should make a mistake. Now I'm just doing a trial arrangement of these pieces once again, because even if I did a trial arrangement before, they invariably take on a different position once I get them on the cookie. Once I've got the primary stem in place, I just want to anchor it in 1 to 2 spots. You don't have to glue the entire length. Again, less is more typically with the gluing process. I'm just going to anchor the leaf at the very base and maybe at the tip of the leaf. Same thing with the buds. They're just going to get anchored to the stem with a little bit of white icing where they make contact with the stem. If any icing shows, at this point it's important to clean it off with a damp paintbrush. So I've got one of each element down: the big flower, the monstera leaf, a hibiscus leaf, a hibiscus stem, and some buds. So you've seen the characteristic anchoring of all types of parts in place. At this point, there's more I want to do. I want to fill in with another leaf behind this big flower and this monstera leaf, but I can't really do that until this guy's completely dry, so I'd like to give that more drying time. I do not like the contact points between the buds and the stem, so I'm going to do a little bit of piping with a dark green, leaf green icing that kind of matches the airbrushed area of the stem, just so it looks like it's a more uniform connection. And once that's all done, I'd give it more drying time, and then I'd come in, as I said, put in that leaf, probably fill in with a bud behind here, and I do want some additional green stalks coming off. Maybe another one up in here and another one down here. But let me put those sepals on, and then I'll move on to showing you some other finished cookies. So every real flower has tiny leaflets at the bottom called sepals. So what I'm doing here is not only concealing the seam, it's also botanically correct. I'm using a leaf tip, a number 349, but all the tips will be in the video description. The process is to push down, apply pressure to create a bead, release pressure to pull back to a tip. And that looks great. And ta-da, after a little more puzzling and pasting, the cookie's all done. Actually, this is a very similar variation to the one I was working on that I did a few days ago. But you can see all the elements are nicely laid in place. I'm just going to rotate it in various directions. The hibiscus has a definite orientation to it, so when you're arranging your platter, you want to arrange things so that things view best from the direction they're most likely to be viewed. So if you enjoyed this dimensional flower, I encourage you to check out the other in my series. As you may recall, I have 2 spring ones, both a snowdrop and a dogwood. I just finished a clematis cookie for the start of the summer botanical series, and I soon have both a poppy and a plumeria coming up. The plumeria is another tropical flower, which is beautiful and simple and very elegant. So I think you'll enjoy all of those. Also, don't forget my SUPERPEER platform. I'd love to connect with you one-on-one in a consultation or just a chat. Till next video, live sweetly.